Hello and welcome to our instructional series of videos. In this installment, we're going to show you how to upgrade or replace the stock PCIe SSD on a 2019 21.5-inch iMac. Replacing the PCIe SSD in these iMacs is an advanced installation with a risk of damage to your screen. It's highly recommended that you watch this video in its entirety before proceeding. If you're unsure about completing this installation yourself, professional installation is available. You should also note that this installation is only for the 21.5-inch models that initially came with the PCIe SSD installed, as the ones that didn't will not have the appropriate port on the logic board to add one later. We've already backed up our data, gathered our materials, shut down and unplugged the iMac, and are working on a soft, static-free work surface. We are now ready to begin. The first thing we need to do is remove the display of the iMac. It's held in place with an adhesive around the edges, which you'll have to cut apart. This is an extremely tricky process which runs the risk of cracking the display, so you'll need to be very careful. Starting on one of the lower corners, insert the screen removal tool between the glass and the chassis. Take care not to put too much stress on the glass itself, or it may crack. Work along all the edges of the iMac, taking care not to push the tool in too deep or pull out too far on the glass. All we're doing is cutting the tape holding the display on, not prying the glass away. The corners may prove to be a little tricky, so you may need to go over them a couple of times. The process may take a little time, so be patient. Once you've worked your way all the way around, you can lay the computer face up on your work surface and attach the suction cups to the upper corners. Do one last check to make sure you've loosened all the adhesive around the edges of the iMac. Then lift the glass part way up using the suction cups. Inside, near the top, you'll need to detach two cables. For the first, simply slide it out of its socket. For the second cable, first lift up on the metal handle to unlock the connector, then slide it out. You can then angle the display the rest of the way up and remove the adhesive holding it. Simply grab the tab on each side of the adhesive strip and slowly pull it towards the center until it comes free. Finally, use your opening tool to slit the last little bit of adhesive along the center, and you should be able to remove the display and set it aside. Now is a good time to peel up any residual adhesive that remains on the iMac chassis so we can replace it later. Do the same for any adhesive on the back of the display itself. The PCIe SSD is located on the back of the main logic board. In order to reach it, we'll need to remove much of the iMac's internals. First, we'll start with the strap along the lip of the iMac, which is held in place by 5 small Phillips screws. You should then be able to slide the piece out of the iMac. Next, we'll remove the fan, which is held in by these 3 Torx T10 screws. Disconnect the fan cable by sliding its connector from its socket, and you should be able to lift the fan out of the iMac. Next, we'll move on to the left speaker. Start by loosening the two Torx T10 screws holding it in place, and pulling it slightly forward. The power button cable runs along channels in the speaker assembly. Slide its connector from the socket and carefully remove the cable from the channels. Next, slide the speaker connector from its socket on the logic board, remove the cable from under the metal retainer, and untape it from the SATA cable. You should now be able to slide the speaker out the rest of the way. Next is the hard drive. It's held in place by two retainers with 4 Torx T10 screws, which we'll need to remove. Once you've done that, you can lift the drive up slightly and detach it from the SATA cable, allowing you to remove it completely. Moving on to the power board, we need to remove these two Torx T8 screws. Then detach the power supply signal cable's connector by sliding it from its slot. This will give you enough room to pull the power board forward slightly and up so you can disconnect this larger power connector. There's a small latch on the underside which you'll need to push down on in order to release it. There is one last cable to disconnect located in the lip of the iMac. Press down on the latch of its connector and slide it out. You can now set the power board aside. Now we can remove the hard drive bracket. It's held in place with this Torx T8 screw. You should now be able to flip it over and remove the SATA cable from underneath these two tabs. Moving on to the right speaker, loosen its two Torx T10 screws, and disconnect its speaker cable much like we did with the left one. Then, remove the antenna cable that's routed along its outside edge. You can then move the whole assembly towards the edge, away from the logic board. Next, remove the two Torx T5 screws that hold the AirPort and Bluetooth cables in place, along with the metal shield that covers them. You can then carefully disconnect the snap connectors that attach the cables to the board. The cables are short and stiff enough that they'll retain the proper order when it comes time to reassemble the iMac. Disconnect the camera cable by lifting up on the metal latch, then sliding the connector out of its socket. To disconnect the microphone cable, lift up on the tiny latch on the opposite end of the socket, then slide the cable out. The headphone connector simply lifts up and off its socket. We can now remove the 4 Torx T8 screws holding the board in place. If the iMac has never been opened, the screw nearest the Apple logo will have an anti-tamper cover on it. You can simply pierce it with the tip of your screwdriver in order to unscrew it. The remaining screws will remove as normal. The last 4 screws to remove are these 4 Torx T8 screws holding the heatsink in place. You should now be able to remove the main logic board from the iMac. You may need to maneuver the board a little bit to get the I/O ports around the mounting post near the lower right corner. The SSD module is located here near the I/O ports. To remove the original drive, first remove its Torx T8 retaining screw. Then, slide the drive out of its slot. The new drive will have a notch in its connector. This will line up with a pin in the PCIe SSD slot. Slide the drive into its slot until it's fully seated. Then secure it with its Torx T8 screw. We're now ready to replace the logic board back into the iMac. Located near the I/O ports are 2 pins. These 2 pins line up with these 2 slots in the iMac's chassis to help align the board when replacing it. Replace the logic board into the iMac, taking care not to trap any cables underneath. The aforementioned pins and slots will help indicate when the board is properly positioned. Once it is, we can reattach the board to the iMac, starting with the heatsink screws. The longer 2 screws go in the top holes. The 2 shorter ones go in the lower holes. You can then replace the 4 Torx T8 screws that hold the logic board in place. Now we can reconnect all the cables to the logic board. For the microphone cable, slide it all the way into its connector. Then push down on the latch located on the opposite side of the cable. To reconnect the headphone cable, simply align the 2 connectors and snap them together. Slide the camera cable into its socket, then use the metal bar to latch it into place. Arrange the Bluetooth and airport antenna cables in order over their connectors. Then snap the connectors together by pushing on them straight down. On the long edge of the metal cover, there are 4 small teeth. These align with 4 small holes in the rectangular piece behind the connectors. Set the cover into place. Then secure it and the cables using the 2 Torx T5 screws. Now let's move on to the right speaker. First, slide its connector cable into its socket. Next, move the speaker assembly back into place next to the logic board. Then, route the antenna cable down the channel on the outside edge of the speaker. And finally, secure the assembly in place with its 2 Torx T10 screws. Route the SATA cable through the tabs on the underside of the hard drive bracket, Then flip the bracket over, tuck the SATA cable under the metal retainer, and secure the bracket into place with its Torx T8 screw. Plug the smaller power supply cable into its socket underneath the lip of the chassis near the Apple logo. Next, attach the larger power cable to the socket that's on the underside of the logic board. You can now set the board back into the iMac so it lays flat. Slide the power supply signal cable's connector into its socket, and you can secure the board with its two Torx T8 screws. Align the SATA connection on your drive with the one on the iMac's cable and slide the two together. You can then set the drive into its bracket. Place the two plastic retainers over the drive and secure them with the four Torx T10 screws. The retainer on the outer edge gets the two identical middle-sized screws. For the other side, the shortest screw goes in the upper hole that hangs over the SATA cable, and the longest screw goes through the power board. Set the left speaker partially into place so that just the narrow end is under the lip. There's a groove along the speaker assembly at this point where we need to route the power button cable. The solid wrapped portion of the cable goes in the groove that runs along the face of the speaker assembly. Then the twisted wire part goes in the groove along the side. You can now move the speaker into place. This will allow you to slide the power button cable's connector into its socket. You can now tighten the speaker's two Torx T10 screws. Route the speaker cable behind the mounting post and along the side of the SATA cable. Use the tape to help hold it in place and slide it underneath the metal retainer clip. Finally, slide the cable connector into its socket on the logic board, and it's time to move on to the fan. Set the fan into place and secure it with its three Torx T10 screws. The one with the rubber standoff attached goes in the spot that's nearest the top of the iMac. Finally, slide the fan connector into its socket. The last thing to replace is the strip along the bottom lip of the iMac. Take one of the longer Phillips screws and attach one of the corners, rotating the strip into place as you tighten the screw. Then, use the remaining longer screws to secure the other points, skipping the one in the center. The center hole can then be secured by the shorter screw that's remaining. We're now ready to close up. Set the display tape pieces in place according to the diagram that comes with the kit. You'll know that they're positioned correctly if all the holes and cutouts line up correctly with the shape of the iMac chassis. Once you've determined all the pieces of tape have been placed correctly, peel off the backing and adhere them to their places on the iMac. You can help line it up easier by inserting a pointed object through the hole in the tape and using it to line the tape up with the corresponding hole in the iMac's chassis. You can then peel off the backing on the other side to expose the adhesive that will attach the display. Set the display along the bottom edge as flush with the lip and as centered as possible, but don't let it close yet as we need to reconnect the last two cables. Reattach the video cable by sliding the connector into its socket and locking it into place with the handle. Then, simply slide the last connector into its socket. You can now carefully lower the display into place, making sure you have the edges lined up correctly. Gently squeeze along the edges to make sure the adhesive sticks. Use the microfiber cloth to avoid any extra fingerprints. You can now remove the suction cups and clean any remaining marks off your iMac. You can now plug your iMac back in, hook it up, and turn it on.